Although the vast majority of these Russian casualties are not boys from Moscow and Petersburg. They're from the east, from Buryatia and Siberia. They're foreigners, they're convicts. They're the troops that Russia doesn't care about. But nevertheless, as losses get towards the million mark, which they will on present trends by the end of the year, that has to have some effect. However indifferent Putin personally is to all of this, and he does seem to be indifferent, but that will have some effect on Russian society, which is now full of disquiet about all of this. So the Ukrainians are making the Russians pay, although it's very painful for them themselves. They are making them pay for every inch of ground, and they want to prove that they can continue to do that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau, and it's great to welcome back Professor Michael Clarke. Michael Clarke is a Professor of Defence Studies. He's a former Director General of the British think tank RUSI. He's a leading defence and security analyst, and we speak every week on BFBS SITREP. He's a prolific writer, and his next book, Great British Commanders, is out on the 30th of September. Michael Clarke, great to see you again.
Yeah, always good to be here.
Yeah, can you just bring us up to date on the battlefield situation in Ukraine, specifically in Donetsk Oblast, because there appear to have been dramatic developments around the garrison town of Pokrovsk.
Yes, I mean the whole front has been relatively static, but the Russians made a big push towards Chasiv Yar, which they didn't succeed in, but they got a bit further north of that, and they've been pushing towards Pokrovsk. And they're looking to sort of take a whole series of places. Pokrovsk is quite an important place, but so is Novopokrovsk, and so is Kostiantynivka, which are all west of Bakhmut, which we remember from last year. And what the Russians are trying to do is to make some real progress at Pokrovsk, and they're still quite a few kilometers away from it, I have to say. And they're stuck onto the roads there, really. They can't do very much off the roads, although they try. But they're trying to use that as the way in from the south towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And the point is, we've talked about these places for a long time, if they take Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, then effectively they've got the whole of the Donbass. And that's what the Russians have been pushing for. They tried from the north at one time, from Lyman. They tried from the east, from Bakhmut. The way to get there is from the south. Although it's further, that's where the access is, because the ground will take it. There are roads, there are rail lines, and so on. So if they take Pokrovsk, then they will have a much better chance of moving on towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And they are hoping that the Ukrainians are so stretched in the north, in the east, and now in the south, that they won't be able to stop them. So the Russians are making a pretty determined push now. It's still quite a small push, but the way they're pushing indicates that they think that they've got an opening. And if they get to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, that will be a strategic turning point for them, because it will give Putin some reason to say, make a peace deal on this basis, and I'll just sit in Ukraine and with the land bridge to Crimea.
Yeah, interesting. And the clock is ticking with the American election coming up. I'll ask you a bit about that in a while. And specifically on that push towards Pokrovsk, Ukraine's 97th Air Assault Brigade, they've uploaded a video on social media, which they claim to show smashing this advance. They say they've struck 6 tanks, 7 armoured personnel carriers, and 40 people have been killed. I mean, what can you tell us about the veracity of that?
Yeah, so the 79th Air Assault Brigade. They've issued a lot of stuff on video, and it is very convincing in the sense that, yes, I don't think it's made up. These armoured vehicles are being hit. What we can't be sure about is exactly where this is taking place, unless it's geolocated, and that, it can be geolocated, but I haven't seen that so far. But undoubtedly, they are scoring some quite big hits, which shows that the Ukrainians are getting more ammunition now. I mean, the Ukrainians have always said, we can make life much, much harder for the Russians if we weren't running out of ammunition. So that's clearly the case. The other thing, though, that's interesting about this is that the Russians, where they've been making progress all along the front, have been doing it because they are dismounting. They're getting out of their vehicles and they're making it in small detachments of troops, and they're throwing their troops forward with no regard to how many of them get killed, and lots of them do. So they're using their foreign mobilized troops and the convicts that they've got, their cheap troops, and they're throwing them forward to locate the firing positions of the Ukrainians, and then they're hitting the Ukrainians with artillery from those firing positions. So they're sacrificing the lives deliberately of their forward troops, and then they're making progress by dismounting, by moving forward in small detachments. They only go back in their vehicles because they know they are vulnerable in their vehicles to modern warfare, but they only go back in their armoured vehicles when they think they are making the breakthrough. So the fact that the 79th have taken out so many armoured vehicles, a big armoured thrust on the road to Pokrovsk, tells me that the Russians think that they are making a big breakthrough. They wouldn't get back into their vehicles unless they thought they could push right through now. Now, whether they can or not, we don't know, but that's something that we'll be keeping our eye on in the next few days. We're not now so concerned about Chasiv Yar, which was in the crosshairs a couple of weeks ago, still vulnerable, but Chasiv Yar looks to be more stable. But the road to Pokrovsk, that now seems to be the main focus of whether the Russians are about to make a breakthrough and whether the Ukrainians can hold them. The fact that the Ukrainians are putting all this video out seems to indicate that they think they are holding them and producing huge losses, but that also may be propaganda undertaken when things are not going well for Kiev.
Obviously, intense fighting for any gains made by Russia, but in an article by The Economist recently, it questions how long they can continue to keep this up because they're increasingly having to raid stores in the Soviet area of tanks and armoured infantry fighting vehicles and artillery to keep going. How do you see it?
Yeah, the Russians have brought enough onto the battlefield to create this push. Remember, this push has been going on since about March, where they've tried to increase the pressure everywhere all at once, all the way around that big semicircle of front, from Kharkiv in the north right round to the south towards Orikhiv, where the Ukrainians have tried to push through in the summer. So it's like a big semicircle. And the Russians have tried to push all the way around that circle. So they tried at Kharkiv, they've tried at Kupiansk, they're now trying at Pokrovsk. Before that, they've been pushing at Chasiv Yar and Novoveselka, all of those areas. They can't keep that up forever, and they will probably start to run out of steam. This is what The Economist was saying toward the end of the year when the weather starts to turn, which it will do in September, October. I mean, the weather is pretty predictable in Ukraine because it's part of the Russian steppes. You know it's going to be very hot in the summer. You know it'll be very cold in the winter. You know pretty well when the rains will start and when the ground will get wet. So within a week either way, that's pretty predictable. So the Russians know that they will run out of time, and they're pushing as hard as they can before they begin to run out of time for this offensive to make some real progress. And next year, the Russians will struggle. They've increased their war production, of course. They've got more stuff coming in from North Korea and Iran, and they may get more of that. They may get more from China, and there's a big political issue there. But in terms of their own production, they plateau sometime in 2025 in terms of the increases that they've made this year. So, the Russians are certainly not invincible, and the Ukrainians figure that if they can hold them this summer and autumn, then things, depending on what happens in the rest of the world, things may start to get better for the Ukrainians in the spring of next year. And so I think both sides, in a sense, are playing up to the autumn. They're playing for the rest of this fighting season, and both sides, one is trying to make a breakthrough, one is trying to hold on. Both sides understand that spring 2025 will be the moment for some decision on the battlefield that we haven't seen for the last 18 months.
And apart from the weather, and you talk about what about the US election? I mean, how do you think the prospect of a new president is actually determining the short and the long-term strategies for both the Russians and the Ukrainians? Because you mentioned Russia trying to get as much as the Donbass as possible. How is that playing into their strategy?
Yeah, I think it's having a big effect, Kate. I mean, obviously, if Trump is elected, then things would start to change immediately, because if he's elected on the 5th of November, he doesn't become president until the second week of January. But the knowledge that he is going to become president would start to create lots of changes in NATO, in the attitude of East European governments, and in the Ukrainian attitude and the Russian attitude. So, before he lifts a finger, the idea that he will create the circumstances in which the Ukrainians will be forced into negotiating on very bad terms, that expectation will begin to work its way through. In the longer run, that scenario, in a sense, is facing the Ukrainians anyway, but maybe not under such extreme circumstances. So in other words, even if, let's say, Kamala Harris is elected, the Democrats, retain the White House and the Congress remains democratic effectively, then the United States will still not fight for Ukraine, as it were, won't give it tremendous amounts of aid in the years to come, but it will actually help it get into a better negotiating position. So the Ukrainians know that they're probably going to have to try to achieve a much better negotiating position sometime during next year. And in that respect, the key issue is Putin seen to fail in Ukraine? By the middle of next year, will the world perceive that the Russians have basically failed? And does he therefore have to make a deal on that basis? If that's the case, then most people in the West would say that's a pretty good outcome. But if the perception is that he has succeeded, that somehow the aggression has been rewarded and therefore he'll be back for more in a couple of years' time, if that is the perception, then the Ukrainians will be taken to a negotiating position which is completely unacceptable to them. And if they're forced into it, then so be it. But whereas the Trump administration would force them into it quite quickly, the American Democratic administration might edge them towards it over the course of another year or 18 months. And that, of course, will be a very different situation for them.
And as we wait for that election in November, I mean, to what extent do you think the Ukrainian strategy is to show that every single inch of ground that the Russian forces might take, they have to pay a very high price in terms of manpower?
Yeah, well, that is the case at the moment. I mean, even the conservative estimates of our own Ministry of Defence are that the Russian losses are now at 550,000. The new chief of the general staff only this week, and the head of the British Army, said that they'll be looking at 1 million to 1.5 million in about a year's time at current rates of loss. I mean, it is confirmed that the Russians are losing 1,200 men a day, every day. That's loss in terms of death and serious injury. So they've got to be taken away from the battle zone itself. They can't continue to function because they're so badly injured or they're lying dead on the battlefield. So 1,200 a day. And although the vast majority of these Russian casualties are not boys from Moscow and Petersburg, they're from the east, from Buryatia and Siberia. They're foreigners, they're convicts. They're the troops that Russia doesn't care about. But nevertheless, as losses get towards the 1 million mark, which they will on present trends by the end of the year, that has to have some effect. However indifferent Putin personally is to all of this, and he does seem to be indifferent, but that will have some effect on Russian society, which is now full of disquiet about all of this. So the Ukrainians are making the Russians pay, although it's very painful for them themselves. They are making them pay for every inch of ground, and they want to prove that they can continue to do that. But for Ukraine, the problem is that they've also got to show that they can actually retake ground. They've got to show that they can get back on the offensive. Otherwise, the Western world is going to say, well, look, if you can't retake ground, however slowly you're losing it, you ought to negotiate before you lose even more. So the Ukrainians have got to show they can take back significant areas in order to go into some sort of negotiation in next year or even the year after on much more favorable terms, which is what they'll be trying to do.
Now, a Ukrainian naval spokesperson is reported to have declared that Russia has now pulled all of its ships out of the Sea of Azov. This after the last remaining warship left Sevastopol, former home to the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine also claims to have destroyed the last railway ferry being used to transport equipment and forces on Crimea. What is the strategy? Can you see it developing for Crimea?
Yeah, Ukrainians do have some real success here because we all concentrate on them losing territory in the Donbass and in the southern part of Ukraine, in Zaporizhia and so on. And that is true. They are doing that and they're not retaking territory. But they have had a countervailing strategic gain in not recapturing Crimea. That's a very big ask, and that won't happen for some time, if ever. But they have made Crimea effectively unviable as a Russian base, and they've regained control of the western part of the Black Sea. So everything west of Sevastopol now belongs to the Ukrainians. They're able to, their shipping is back to peacetime levels. So about 120 ships, 130 ships a month are going backwards and forwards out of the Odessa and the ports around Odessa through the Dardanelles. So that's really important to the Ukrainians. They've re-established their trade. The Russians have sort of had to give up on the western part of the Black Sea for that reason. And more importantly, as the Ukrainians have got closer to Crimea, they're able, with the use of drones and some really modified cruise missiles, they're now making Crimea unviable as the great sort of storehouse for the Russian military operating operating to the north in that part of Ukraine, in the southern part of Ukraine itself. And that's a big strategic gain, because seizing Crimea in 2014 is Putin's pride and joy. The Kerch bridge is Putin's engineering pride and joy. And if the Ukrainians can keep that bridge under threat, and I'm sure they're going to attack it as much as they can in the coming months, if they can take out the ferries, if they can make the route from Russia proper into Crimea very difficult for the Russians, then that is a big strategic gain. And the fact that the Russian Black Sea Fleet have more or less moved all the way back to Novorossiysk, which is in Russia proper, in the eastern part of the Black Sea, that's a pretty big strategic gain. They haven't bottled up the fleet, but they've made it retreat to a safe port because Crimea is no longer safe. And if it comes to negotiations, then the safety of Crimea is a very important card which the Ukrainians now have in their hand. They'll need a lot more, but that's a really important, it's not quite a trump card, but it's certainly a jack or a queen in the hand that they've got to play as and when it comes to some tough negotiations.
On the subject of the Kerch Bridge, which links the occupied peninsula to Russia, do you think it is just a matter of time before it's destroyed?
Well, I think the Ukrainians would bombard it now if they could. The fact is, it's been attacked, 2-3 times now in different ways. And every time they attack it, the Russians tighten up all their defenses around it. It is said that the Russians have got their only S-500 air defense system, which is their most advanced. It's still really under development. They've only got one battery, apparently. And they've taken that battery out of Russia and put it into Crimea because they're so worried about what's happening into the Kerch Bridge. I think the Ukrainians will continue to try to attack it, and they'll think of different ways of doing it. Of course, if the Germans would allow them to have Taurus missiles, then I think they'd attack it relentlessly. And that's the very reason the Germans won't give them Taurus missiles. Some would say that's the whole point of giving them Taurus missiles, so they can attack the bridge. But for Berlin, this is a step too far. They just won't do it. They worry that what they give the Ukrainians will be too effective to help them gain the advantage, so they won't do it. In my view, that's a great shame.
Yeah, it has caused a lot of hand-wringing, hasn't it? The British government, though, has now given its permission for Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. How much of a difference do you think that can make? What kind of targets come into range, and what can they achieve with this?
Yeah, I mean, Britain's still been very ambiguous about this, but interestingly, the Ministry of Defence, they said, oh, we've given them Storm Shadow, they can do what they like with them. And then Downing Street said something a little bit different. And Downing Street has been quite cautious. I think the Starmer government is being cautious, but they now seem to be saying that you can use them in areas of Russia that have a direct effect on the front. But what the Ukrainians really want is permission to use Storm Shadow much deeper inside Russia, so they can attack the airfields from which Russian aircraft are taking off with glide bombs, because these glide bombs are doing immense damage on the front lines. And the only way you can do something about that is you've got to go after the aircraft before the bomb is dropped or released. And that means you've either got to attack the airbase or you've got to be able to attack the aircraft over Russian territory, because a lot of these glide bombs are being released before they're even over Ukrainian territory, before the aircraft has even crossed the border. And for that, Storm Shadow would work. Taurus would be better, but Storm Shadow do work, and they're very good. They have a unitary warhead, which means they're very good against one target, but they don't cover big targets. They don't cover a big area. And although the Storm Shadow warhead is penetrative, it's not as good as a penetrating weapon as Taurus, because it's based on a timer. So in other words, the warhead goes down and it explodes underground a few milliseconds later. But the best sort of penetrative warheads work on pressure. So they explode at exactly the right pressure, not when you've guessed that it will be at the right time. So the penetrative warhead on Storm Shadow is good, but it's not the best. Storm Shadow would make a difference if the Ukrainians can use them against airfields deep inside Russia. But it's not clear to me yet that the British have allowed that unless there's something in the pipeline that we haven't heard about.
So what's your understanding about what the British position actually is at the moment then?
That Storm Shadow can certainly be used in the occupied territories because that's Ukrainian territory. So they can certainly be used in Crimea. They can certainly be used against the Kerch bridge if they're effective. They can certainly be used in the Donbass. The British government have also said they can be used in the close battle, as it were, just over the Russian border, in ways that would prevent the Russians developing troop concentrations. But that's not where Storm Shadow is actually at its best. And the British have not said, as far as I understand it, that you can use them for deep penetration into Western Russia to go after the aircraft dropping the glide bombs.
Let's just touch on politics a bit more. Ukraine's top ambassador, the foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has met his counterpart in China. He says Kyiv is open to talks with Moscow if it was prepared to negotiate in good faith, something which he saw no evidence of for now, of course. What can he gain from this visit to China?
Yeah, I mean, they've got to do this because the Ukrainians, created the peace summit in Switzerland a couple of months ago, and they are looking now to another summit in the autumn where they try to bring mainly the global south together to show that they're not just turning their blind eye to peace. They may be the ones who've been invaded. They may be the ones who are fighting for their lives, but they're not disinterested in peace talks if the Russians were serious about it. And whereas the Russians have talked all the time about negotiations, but always entirely on their own terms, the Ukrainians need to show that they've got a peace plan that's not so far away from the Chinese peace plan, is what they would like to say, and that they don't want to be on the back foot about this, so that the Ukrainians are moving forward. The Russian peace plan is getting harder all the time because Putin's quite chipper at the moment and he still believes or hopes that Donald Trump will be elected. What Putin is aiming for is this. It's very clear that there will be a Russia-America summit, a Putin-Trump summit, quite soon in the new year, February or March. And Russia and America will sit down, old style, Cold War old style, just two of them. I mean, Putin's got no interest in talking to Zelensky. Putin wants to talk to Trump, and they will decide what will be offered to Ukraine. They will decide the outcome. The Europeans won't be involved. The Ukrainians certainly won't be involved. The two superpowers will make it happen. And that's what Putin wants. And what he is saying at the moment is he wants all four oblasts on which he is still fighting. So he hasn't even taken them all yet. So he wants Luhansk and Donetsk, which he hasn't yet conquered. He wants Zaporizhia, which he hasn't yet conquered. And he wants Kherson, which he hasn't yet conquered, in addition to keeping Crimea. So he wants the Crimea. He wants to hold on to Crimea that he held in 2014. He wants all of the oblasts that he's still fighting in the other four. So he wants 5 oblasts, about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and then he wants some sweeteners to actually help understand that he won't be coming back in a couple of years' time for even more, which we all know he will. And the sweeteners include demilitarization of Ukraine, so they're going to have limits on their military. Russian establishment of the Russian language as a co-official language of Ukraine, guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO, and guarantees that anti-Russian political parties will be banned in Ukraine. So these are the sweeteners that he will want, in other words, to make Ukraine a non-viable state, which cannot stand up to the next attack in a couple of years' time, that he will then go away and get ready for. So that's his negotiating position at the moment. Now, nobody in their right mind would go along with that. And the Americans certainly don't expect the Ukrainians to go along with it. But somehow the Ukrainians have got to come up with some sort of formula which shows that they take seriously the idea that they could negotiate, but certainly not on the basis of what Putin wants. But Putin, at the moment, is going for the full package because he believes that the world is moving in his direction. And at the moment, you can't say he's not wrong. He may not turn out to be wrong.
Yeah, and interesting you say that because of the kind of comments that have been made by the new head of the British Army in London, a conference only this week. And he was basically outlining a scenario where basically multiple conflicts could break out around the world. A dangerous Russia perhaps seeking revenge on countries that supported Ukraine. China invaded Taiwan, Iran becoming more aggressive. And he points the risk of this problem in one area triggering a sympathetic detonation in another. Do you think that kind of risk will increase the longer the war in Ukraine goes on?
Yes, and that's the world that we're now into. I mean, Britain defined the four areas of four adversaries some years ago before the invasion of Ukraine, and we defined Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. We said in different ways and for different reasons, those four countries are our adversaries, and we started to name them after 2015, particularly as we were getting more worried about Russia. But they were not. They were not part of it. They weren't an axis of destabilization, which is now what they're regarded as, and they're certainly not an axis of evil in the way that the United States used to define these countries during the George W. Bush era. But what has happened since the invasion of Ukraine is that those four countries have now really started to pull together because of the Ukraine war. So China is closer to Russia than it was before the Ukraine war because it's got to save Russia from this great strategic blunder that Putin has created. And North Korea and Iran have now decided to throw in their lot with Russia because Russia needs them. And what you can see happening in 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine, it was an opportunist attack from a sort of a regional imperialist. That's what Putin was. He was a regional imperialist trying to recreate the Russian Empire in Western Europe of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. But in the 2 years since the war has gone badly for him and is becoming a sort of forever war, Putin has now turned from an opportunist imperialist into an ideologue for a fundamental shift in world politics. And so this group of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are now the vanguard of an explicit attempt to transform the nature of world politics. And they're saying to the global south, to the rest of the world, the old Western order has gone. Liberal democracies have gone. Democracies are ridiculous. Just look at what happens in Western democracies in Europe. Look at how ridiculous the American democracy is. You don't really want that, do you? And that we represent the new liberating forces. We may be autocratic, but our autocracy will liberate you from this ridiculous liberal imperialism that you've suffered from for the last century and a half. And so this whole conflict in Ukraine has actually turned into an ideological struggle of one autocratic order against the liberal democratic world that the rest of us have been brought up in, and which has existed now for well over a century and a half. And so Putin has turned into an ideologue of fundamental global change. Now, we see that as disorder. They see it as the necessary growing pains of a new world order that they will be at the pinnacle of, and that will actually diminish democracy, which is a busted flush, doesn't produce anything, and will fundamentally change the nature of world politics. That's what's now at stake because, fundamentally, of the Ukraine crisis.
And just a final thought then, Mike. The Ukrainian ambassador to London, the former commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, he spoke at this land warfare conference that took place at Russia in London. And he said Western countries need to wake up. And your message there seems to be a wake-up call too, and prepare for the threat of a third world war. How great is that threat at the moment, do you think?
Yeah, when people talk about a third world war, we're not really talking about a war that would look like the Second World War or the First World War for different reasons. Those were wars that internationalized themselves in new ways. But I think what we might be looking at is a systemic conflict that goes on around different parts of the world, but is united by what the Ukraine war has now become, which is the symbol, the cutting edge of an attempt to change the very nature of global power. And that looks as if at the moment that project is going quite well, because the Western alliance, or the Western world, has really not geared up to that. We're hoping to deal with this as a crisis that doesn't inconvenience us too much. And what Zaluzhny was saying at the conference is, look, this is more than a crisis. We are all now fighting for the existence of Western liberal democracy. We in Ukraine are on the cutting edge. You in Europe are at the second echelon. United States and the rest of the Western world is the third echelon. But we're all in this war because the dictators and the gangsters out there are declaring the war on us. We didn't declare it on them. They're declaring it on us. And at the moment, the fighting front is Ukraine, but it will be in other places as well within a few years. If we lose in Ukraine, then we'll have to start fighting this war in other parts of Europe, other parts of the world. And I think that's absolutely true. this is this is the front that we ought to succeed on, because if we fail on this one, we'll find ourselves fighting on other fronts, which will engage us and create a cost to our own sons and grandsons, much, much greater than anything so far.
Sobering thought to end on, but very good to speak to you, Michael Clarke. Thank you so much for your time.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.